A white landlord refuses to rent his property to a black family, but what he doesn't realize is that his decision will lead to a shocking discovery about his own son's connection to the family, shattering everything he thought he believed. In this story, we'll dive into how one man's prejudice leads him down a path of transformation he never saw coming. Through unexpected connections and heartfelt realizations, he's forced to face his own biases and question the life he's built. If you're curious to see how this journey unfolds, hit that subscribe button and make sure you don't miss the ending. And let me know what you think so far. If you're ready to hear the whole story, comment 1 below, and if you're really excited to see how it turns out, comment 2. Mr. Bennett, a middle-aged property owner with sharp features and a resolute demeanor, stood at the expansive window of his home office, overlooking the perfectly manicured lawns and stately homes of the neighborhood he had curated for over a decade. He took immense pride in the beauty and order he maintained across his properties, convinced that his strict guidelines kept the neighborhood exclusive, desirable, and in his mind, safe. With a satisfied sigh, Mr. Bennett turned back to his desk, his eyes falling on a lineup of framed photos, each showcasing one of his pristine properties. The sight reminded him of his journey from owning a small apartment building to a portfolio of upscale rental properties, a journey that had demanded hard work, persistence, and a commitment to his high standards. "I've built this empire on my own terms," he mused aloud, a hint of pride coloring his voice. Bookmark. His attention was then drawn to a stack of rental applications on his desk. Each one had undergone his meticulous screening process. For Mr. Bennett, only the right kind of tenants could be allowed to live in his properties. Each application had to meet his expectations, which went beyond financial stability to more subjective qualities. Qualities Mr. Bennett believed he could discern through intuition and his years of experience. "Can't just let anyone live here," he muttered, flipping through the papers, the stack thinning as he added several applications to the rejection pile. Then he paused over one particular application, his brow furrowing slightly at the sight of the name. The Jefferson family. An unexpected twinge of hesitation passed through him. Despite Mr. Jefferson's strong financial background, impeccable credit score, and glowing references, Mr. Bennett felt a pang of discomfort as he studied the family's photo. There stood Mr. Jefferson, his wife, Clara, and their 3 young daughters, each of them smiling warmly for the camera. But despite everything, Mr. Bennett couldn't shake his unease. "No," he murmured quietly, tossing the application to the side. "It would change the whole character of the neighborhood," he justified to himself. Deep down, Mr. Bennett knew that his reservations were based on his own biases, not the family's suitability as tenants. Still, he told himself it was his duty to protect the environment he had created. He believed that other tenants wouldn't appreciate a family like the Jeffersons moving in. It was simply better this way, he reasoned. Resolute in his decision, Mr. Bennett returned to his task, rationalizing that he was doing what was best for his community. It was his property after all, and in his mind, he had every right to choose who would live there. In the modest kitchen of their small rented apartment, the Jefferson family gathered around the dinner table, faces lit with excitement and anticipation. Robert Jefferson, a tall man with a warm, comforting presence, sat beside his wife, Clara, whose eyes sparkled with hope. Between them lay the application packet for a home in one of Mr. Bennett's upscale neighborhoods, a place they felt would be perfect for their growing family. "Girls," Robert began, glancing at his 3 daughters, "this new house could mean more space for each of us. No more bumping into each other, just trying to get ready in the mornings." The girls, each at varying ages between 7 and 12, giggled with excitement, their imaginations already filling with possibilities. Clara joined in, her voice gentle yet eager. "And the neighborhood is closer to your schools. You wouldn't have to get up so early every morning just to catch the bus." She gave Robert's hand a quick squeeze, her heart brimming with hope. "Imagine, we'd have a real backyard where you could play, maybe even plant some flowers." The girl's eyes sparkled with excitement. The eldest, Amara, spoke up first. "Can I finally have my own room?" she asked, her voice filled with the hopeful curiosity only a child can muster. Robert chuckled, ruffling her hair affectionately. Maybe not a full room to yourself, Amara, but definitely more space. He winked at her, his own heart feeling lighter with the dreams they were building together. Beside her sisters, the youngest daughter, Sophie, chimed in, her voice almost a whisper. "Do you think we could get a dog, Dad?" Robert and Clara exchanged an amused glance, laughing gently. "One thing at a time, sweetheart," Clara said with a warm smile. She lifted Sophie onto her lap, giving her a reassuring hug. "But it's a big step for our family, a house we could grow into, a place we could finally call home." The family talked long into the evening, imagining what their lives would be like in this new home. They pictured birthday parties in the backyard, Sunday morning breakfasts in a sunlit kitchen, and summer evenings spent on a front porch. This move, they knew, would mean the world to them. A step toward fulfilling dreams they had worked so hard to create together. For the Jeffersons, this was more than just a change of address. It was a symbol of the progress they had made, of the life they had strived to build. Clara placed a comforting hand on Robert's arm as he reviewed their application one final time. Despite his steady demeanor, she could sense the nerves beneath his calm. "We've always been good tenants, everywhere we've lived," she reassured him, her voice steady and full of conviction. "We've done everything right, Robert. I'm sure Mr. Bennett will see that." Robert nodded, squeezing her hand in return. He wanted to believe her, to hold on to the optimism and love that filled their small apartment that evening. The Jeffersons knew that they were deserving of this opportunity. They had worked hard, saved diligently, and proven themselves time and again. They felt ready, hopeful, and more than capable of making this new home a beautiful chapter in their lives. Unaware of the obstacles that lay ahead, they remained unified by their love for one another, their faith, and their resilience. Whatever challenges came their way, they would face them together, each of them a beacon of hope for the others. As they completed the application and prepared to submit it, they shared one last look. A silent promise that, no matter the outcome, their family would always be the heart of their home. Days later, Robert Jefferson sat at the kitchen table, shoulders slumped as he stared down at the letter in his hands. Across the top, in clear, bold letters, the word "rejected" was stamped, leaving no room for confusion. The rejection stung more than he had anticipated. After all the effort, the planning, and the dreams he and Clara had painted for their daughters, their hopes had been shut down in an instant. Clara entered the room and, upon seeing the letter in Robert's hand, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked, her voice soft but brimming with concern. Robert glanced up, his eyes filled with disappointment and frustration. "It's for Mr. Bennett," he murmured. "Our application, it's been turned down." His voice was barely a whisper, but the weight of his words filled the room, casting a heavy silence over them. Clara took a deep breath, letting the news sink in. She knew how much this home meant to their family, how deeply Robert had longed to provide a more stable, spacious environment for their daughters. Her heart ached not only for him, but for their girls, who had already begun to dream of their own rooms, a backyard, and a dog. Robert's tone turned from sadness to determination. "But you know what?" he said, lifting his head to meet Clara's gaze. "We don't need his fancy house. If he won't let us in, then we'll build our own home." A spark of resolve ignited in his eyes, the disappointment now fueling his determination. Clara's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and admiration filling her expression. "Build our own home?" she repeated, searching his face for confirmation. "Are you sure, Robert?" He nodded, a small but confident smile playing on his lips. "Yes, I am. We'll find a piece of land, maybe on the outskirts of town. It might not be a big fancy house, but it will be ours, a home we can make together, filled with love and laughter. No one can take that away from us." Moved by his resilience, Clara gave his hand a gentle squeeze, pride shining in her eyes. "That's my Robert," she said warmly, her smile softening the lingering tension in the room. "You always find a way forward, even when things seem impossible." As Robert stood up, he drew Clara into a tight embrace. "It won't be easy," he murmured into her hair, letting himself feel the weight of the road that lay ahead. "But together, I know we can make it work. We always do." As if on cue, their three daughters tumbled into the kitchen, laughter and curiosity lighting up their faces. "What's going on, Dad?" Amara, the oldest, asked, sensing the change in the room's atmosphere. Robert looked at each of his daughters, his heart swelling with love and pride. They were his inspiration, his reason for pushing forward even when the odds felt insurmountable. "Girls," he said, his voice strong and filled with conviction, "we're going to build our own house. It might not be big or fancy, but it will be ours, and we'll make it a home full of love, together as a family." The girls' faces lit up with excitement, their earlier dreams rekindling. "Can we help, Dad?" Sophie asked eagerly, her eyes wide with hope. "Of course," Robert replied, his laughter filling the room with a renewed sense of hope. "We'll do it together as a family." Clara watched as her husband and daughters spoke, her heart swelling with gratitude and hope. She knew that the journey ahead would be challenging and full of sacrifices, but she also knew that as long as they had each other, they could face any obstacle with courage and resilience. Together, the Jefferson family resolved to create their own future, one rooted in love, faith, and unity. They would build a home from the ground up, a place that no rejection or prejudice could take away from them. Their dreams might have been delayed, but they were far from defeated. Over the next few weeks, Robert Jefferson's vision of building their own home took shape. It was an ambitious goal, but Robert was nothing if not determined. Every evening, he and Clara would sit down at the kitchen table, sketching out ideas for their future home. Though modest, their plans were filled with purpose: a cozy living room for family nights, enough bedrooms for the girls, and even a small backyard where they could gather and grow a garden together. One Saturday afternoon, Robert and Clara took the girls to a patch of land on the outskirts of town. It was a far cry from Mr. Bennett's upscale neighborhood, but the Jefferson family could see potential in every inch of the lot. Tall grasses swayed in the breeze, and though the land was rough and undeveloped, Robert imagined it as the site of their future home. The girls were immediately drawn to the open space, running around with wild excitement, their laughter filling the quiet surroundings. Clara watched them, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth as she shared a knowing glance with Robert. This land, they both understood, would soon hold the foundation of the life they wanted to build, a life filled with love, hard work, and resilience. As the girls explored, Robert took a deep breath and surveyed the plot. The task ahead would be challenging, and he knew they'd have to balance the building project with his work and the family's daily needs. But he felt ready, anchored by his faith and the support of his family. Later that evening, after the girls had fallen asleep, Robert sat down with Clara to plan out the next steps. He pulled out a notepad and began listing everything they'd need: materials, permits, and even basic tools. They would start small, he explained, doing as much of the work themselves as they could. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and reassuring. "We may not have much, Robert," she said softly, "but we have enough to start. We'll take it one step at a time." Her words bolstered his resolve. Though the road ahead seemed daunting, he knew he wouldn't be walking it alone. Every nail, every board, every brushstroke, they would all be placed with love, built not just with hands but with hearts bound by the shared dream of creating a home for their family. Over the next several weeks, the Jeffersons poured their efforts into clearing the land. After long days at work, Robert would bring the family out to the plot, where he would level the ground and begin laying the framework for what would become their home. Clara would bring snacks for the girls, and together they'd cheer Robert on, helping in whatever small ways they could. Even the girls joined in, picking up small branches and rocks to clear the way. Amara, with her budding curiosity, would ask questions about the process, eager to understand what each task meant. Sophie would follow along closely, copying her father's movements with admirable focus, her tiny hands doing their best to carry the twigs and small tools. Clara and Robert watched their daughters, pride swelling in their hearts. They realized that this experience, as difficult as it was, would be an invaluable lesson for their children, a lesson in hard work, resilience, and what it truly meant to build something together. One evening, as they wrapped up a day of work on the land, the family sat together on the grassy ground, looking out at the partially cleared plot. In the fading light, Robert put his arm around Clara, feeling a sense of peace and accomplishment. "It may be hard now," he murmured, But one day, this will all be worth it. Clara nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. I believe it already is, she replied, because no matter what happens, we're building something real here, something that no one can take away. As the Jefferson family looked out over their future home, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. They knew there would be struggles, and they knew the path would be long and often lonely. But they also knew that they were creating something special, a place made from love, strength, and a deep commitment to one another. While the Jefferson family embarked on their journey to build a home, a new opportunity was taking shape for Marcus, the son of Mr. Bennett. Young and ambitious, Marcus had recently graduated from college and landed a coveted position at Prestige Motors, a luxury car company known for its high-end clientele and commitment to quality. This job was Marcus's first real chance to prove himself, without leaning on his father's influence, and he was determined to make a name for himself. Marcus's first day at Prestige Motors was a whirlwind. The polished showrooms glistened under bright lights, the sleek lines of luxury cars gleaming with promise. As he walked through the showroom, he felt a swell of excitement. Here was a place that represented everything he aspired to: success, independence, and the satisfaction of having achieved something on his own. A cheerful voice broke his thoughts. "You must be Marcus." Turning, he met Sarah, the friendly HR manager, who gave him a welcoming smile. "Welcome to Prestige Motors. Let's get you started." Sarah led Marcus through a tour of the office, introducing him to his new colleagues along the way. As they walked, Marcus noticed a warmth in the interactions between employees. There was a camaraderie in the air, a genuine respect and friendliness that was unlike anything he'd experienced in his father's world. He'd always known his father's way of running the business was rigid and exclusive, so seeing this type of workplace environment was refreshing. Finally, Sarah guided him to his workspace, an open-plan office space that felt modern and collaborative. "Our CEO, Mr. Jefferson, believes in a strong, team-focused environment," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up. "He's built this company on values of respect and integrity, and it shows in the way we all work together." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of the CEO's hands-on approach. "The CEO? Is he actually involved with the team?" "Oh yes," Sarah replied, a hint of pride in her tone. "Mr. Jefferson and his wife are very involved. They believe that everyone, from the janitor to the top executives, deserves to be treated with dignity. It's rare in the business world, but it makes Prestige Motors feel more like a family." As Marcus settled into his role, he couldn't help but feel impressed by the unique culture Mr. Jefferson had created. He noticed how employees across different departments worked together seamlessly, offering each other help and support. It was a sharp contrast to the world he knew, a world where his father valued exclusivity and strict barriers. This was a place that valued collaboration over competition, where people were encouraged to lift one another up. During lunch breaks, Marcus would often overhear conversations about the Jeffersons' ongoing community projects. One afternoon, he heard two colleagues discussing a new initiative. "Can you believe the Jeffersons are using company profits to help fund a community center?" one coworker said. "That's just like them," replied another, smiling. "They're always finding ways to give back." The more Marcus learned, the more his respect for Mr. Jefferson grew. He admired how the CEO's success wasn't just measured by profit margins but by the positive impact he made in people's lives. Here, wealth and success weren't exclusive clubs. They were shared experiences built on kindness and mutual respect. Later that afternoon, Marcus spotted a framed quote on the wall near his desk. "True success is measured by what you give back, not by what you keep for yourself." The words struck a chord deep within him. He thought about his father's philosophy of maintaining control, of curating exclusivity. But here was a thriving business built on generosity and inclusivity, and it was working. In fact, Prestige Motors was one of the most successful companies in the region. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus began to feel at home in his new role. The welcoming environment, the company's values, and the Jeffersons' approach to business inspired him daily. He was slowly realizing that success didn't have to come at the expense of others. It could, instead, be about lifting others up. For the first time, Marcus felt like he was truly learning what it meant to succeed on his own. not just through financial gain, but by being part of something bigger, something meaningful. And the more he learned, the more he began to question everything he had assumed about wealth, respect, and success. As Marcus settled into his position at Prestige Motors, he found himself increasingly drawn to the values that defined the company. Mr. Jefferson and his wife, Clara, were not just corporate figures. They were role models who led by example, fostering a workplace culture that was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Over time, he learned that the Jeffersons had built their business from the ground up, and that their success was the result of tireless work, resilience, and a deep commitment to both their employees and the community. One afternoon, Clara invited Marcus to join them for a community outreach event. The company was organizing a volunteer day to help refurbish a local youth center, and the Jeffersons were at the forefront, rallying employees to get involved. Excited by the chance to connect with the team outside of work, Marcus eagerly accepted. When the day of the event arrived, Marcus showed up at the youth center, surprised to see not only his colleagues, but Mr. and Mrs. Jefferson themselves, both dressed in casual clothes, working alongside their team. Clara handed him a paintbrush with a warm smile. "Glad you could join us, Marcus. Today's all about making this space a better place for the kids in our community." As he painted, Marcus watched the Jeffersons interacting with the volunteers, their humility and warmth shining through in every conversation. They moved among the team, asking about their families, thanking them for their time, and offering words of encouragement. He saw how Clara took extra care to ensure everyone felt comfortable and appreciated, a level of kindness that surprised him. Later, during a break, Marcus found himself chatting with Mr. Jefferson, who had taken a seat beside him, wiping paint from his hands. "Marcus," Mr. Jefferson began, his voice steady and genuine, "we're glad to have you with us. I've heard great things about your work ethic from the team." Marcus felt a surge of pride. "Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Working here has been an eye-opener. I didn't realize a company could be this supportive. That success could look like, well, this." Mr. Jefferson nodded thoughtfully, leaning back with a small smile. "It's a bit different from the traditional corporate world, isn't it? My wife and I believe that success is a shared journey. If our employees and community thrive, so do we." Intrigued, Marcus couldn't help but ask, "How do you manage that balance? I mean, being successful while also being so involved in the community." Mr. Jefferson looked out over the volunteers hard at work, his gaze contemplative. "I've learned that success isn't just about what we gain, it's about what we can give. Clara and I started with almost nothing, but we made it our mission to give back as we grew. We focus on people, not just profits, and that's the difference." His words struck a chord with Marcus, who thought of his father's philosophy, which seemed focused on exclusivity and control rather than community. Here was Mr. Jefferson, a man who had built a thriving business without sacrificing his values, and who had chosen to lift others up rather than push them away. As the event wrapped up, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about the Jeffersons' approach to business and life. Watching Mr. Jefferson leading the team with genuine care and humility, he saw firsthand that true leadership was not about power, but about service. This realization stirred something deep within him, a desire to live with more purpose, to find success in ways that enriched both himself and others. As they were packing up supplies, Clara approached Marcus, her face glowing with pride. "Thank you for helping out today, Marcus. We're so proud of our team and the work they do, and we're thrilled to have you with us." Marcus nodded, a newfound admiration shining in his eyes. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Mrs. Jefferson. Working here, learning from you both, it's teaching me so much. I feel like I'm finally seeing what success can really mean." Clara smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're just happy to share it with you. Success is more fulfilling when it's shared. Remember that, Marcus. It's a lesson that will stay with you wherever you go." The words resonated with him deeply, reshaping his understanding of his own goals. For the first time, he saw a path to success that felt authentic and meaningful, one that didn't require him to put others down, but instead allowed him to bring people together. Bookmark, go back. A few days after the volunteer event, Marcus received an unexpected invitation. Mr. Jefferson approached him at work, a friendly smile on his face. "Marcus, Clara and I would love to have you over for dinner this Friday if you're free. We enjoy getting to know our team better, and we'd like to welcome you as part of the Prestige Motors family." The invitation caught Marcus by surprise, but he accepted eagerly. That Friday evening, he drove to the address Mr. Jefferson had given him, expecting a luxurious house in a high-end neighborhood. To his surprise, however, he arrived at a cozy, modest home on the outskirts of town. The house was neat and well-maintained, but nothing like the sprawling mansion he had anticipated. He double-checked the address and hesitated, wondering if he had made a mistake. Before he could question it further, the door opened, and Clara greeted him with a warm smile. "Marcus, so glad you could make it. Come on in." Stepping inside, Marcus felt immediately at ease. The Jefferson home was small, but it radiated warmth and love. The smell of home-cooked food filled the air, and the soft sound of children laughing came from a room nearby. Robert appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on an apron, his face beaming with pride. "Welcome, Marcus. I hope you're hungry. I've got a pot roast in the oven that I think you'll enjoy." As they gathered around the dinner table, Marcus met the Jeffersons' children, each of whom greeted him politely and with genuine interest. The children were clearly well-mannered and kind-hearted, each of them expressing big dreams with enthusiasm. Ethan, the eldest, shared his aspiration of becoming a doctor, explaining that he wanted to give back to the community that had supported his family. Clara and Robert listened to their children with proud, attentive smiles, encouraging each dream with words of support. The more time Marcus spent with the family, the more he felt captivated by their humble yet richly meaningful lifestyle. He was struck by the simplicity of the Jeffersons' life. Despite their success, they had chosen to live modestly, focusing on what mattered most: family, values, and a commitment to giving back. After dinner, as they sipped on Clara's homemade lemonade, Marcus finally voiced the question that had been lingering in his mind. "Mr. Jefferson, I have to admit I'm surprised. With all you've achieved, I expected you'd live in a more upscale place." Robert chuckled, glancing at Clara, who gave him an encouraging nod. "You know, Marcus, we could afford a larger house, maybe even a mansion in the city's best neighborhoods. But Clara and I wanted our children to grow up with a clear understanding of what's truly valuable in life. We want them to know that happiness and success aren't measured by material possessions, but by the relationships we build and the difference we make in the lives of others." Clara chimed in, her voice filled with gentle conviction. "We believe that the foundation of a strong family is built on love and humility, not wealth. Our home is small, but it's filled with warmth and respect. It's where we teach our kids to work hard, stay grounded, and give back to the community." Marcus was deeply moved. In his father's world, status symbols were everything: houses, cars, and exclusive memberships. Yet here was a family who had chosen to build their lives around values and integrity, rather than wealth. It was a revelation, a stark contrast to the life he'd grown up in, and it resonated with him in ways he hadn't expected. As the evening wound down, Marcus thanked the Jeffersons for their hospitality. "I can't tell you how much tonight has meant to me. Working at Prestige Motors has already taught me so much, but seeing the way you live, the way you're raising your family, it's inspiring." Robert placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his face thoughtful. "We're glad you enjoyed it, Marcus. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are the simplest. Remember, success is best when it's shared. We hope you'll carry that with you, wherever your path takes you." On his drive home, Marcus reflected on the evening, a mix of emotions stirring within him. He thought of his father, Mr. Bennett, and the stark differences between their lives and the Jeffersons. The experience had left him questioning what he truly valued and what kind of success he wanted to pursue. For the first time, he felt a deep desire to break away from the superficial expectations of his upbringing and build something more meaningful. The following evening, Marcus joined his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, for dinner at their spacious, high-end home. The setting was elegant, as always. A chandelier hung over the polished dining table, fine china and silverware were neatly arranged, and soft music played in the background. But as Marcus sat with his parents, his mind kept drifting back to the Jeffersons' modest, joyful home, filled with laughter, warmth, and simplicity. As they began their meal, Mr. Bennett looked across the table at his son. "So, Marcus," he began in his usual authoritative tone, "how's the new job treating you? You haven't said much about it." A smile spread across Marcus's face as he thought about the experiences he'd had at Prestige Motors. "It's amazing, Dad. The company, the people, it's so different from what I expected. The Jeffersons, the owners, are incredible people. They treat everyone like family and truly care about the community." Bennett smiled encouragingly, always happy to hear her son's enthusiasm. "That sounds wonderful, dear. Tell us more about them." Marcus's eyes lit up as he recalled his time with the Jefferson family. "Robert and Clara Jefferson are two of the most grounded people I've ever met. They built the company from scratch, and instead of using their success to show off, they focused on giving back. They live in a modest home, and they're raising their kids to understand the importance of hard work, kindness, and humility." Mr. Bennett's expression shifted from interest to discomfort. His brow furrowed slightly as he listened, setting down his fork with a sense of unease. Marcus, oblivious to his father's reaction, continued passionately. "I was over at their place for dinner, and their kids are incredible. The oldest wants to be a doctor, and the others have big dreams too. The house isn't fancy, but it's filled with love and respect. It felt so real." An uneasy silence filled the room as Mr. Bennett processed his son's words. After a moment, he cleared his throat. "Jefferson, you said? Where exactly do they live?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "On the outskirts of town," Marcus replied, surprised by his father's sudden intensity. "They built the house themselves after they couldn't find a place to rent around here. They're genuinely good people, Dad, and they've achieved so much through hard work and integrity." As Marcus spoke, Mr. Bennett's face grew pale, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Bennett noticed her husband's unusual behavior and turned to him, concern evident in her eyes. "Are you all right, dear? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mr. Bennett took a deep breath, visibly distressed. "Marcus," he began slowly, his voice strained, "this Jefferson family, are they black?" Marcus looked at his father, his expression turning from surprise to confusion. "Yes, Dad, they are, but why does that matter?" The realization struck Mr. Bennett like a blow. He felt a wave of guilt as he remembered the Jeffersons' application to rent one of his properties, the one he had dismissed without a second thought, basing his decision on nothing more than his own biases. The very family his son was now praising so highly was the one he had shut out, and hearing of their accomplishments only intensified his shame. As Marcus continued to share stories about the Jefferson family's generosity, warmth, and success, Mr. Bennett found himself listening with a growing sense of regret. He had always thought he was protecting the character of his neighborhood, but he now began to question what he had really been protecting, and at what cost. For the first time, he began to see his decisions through Marcus's eyes, through the admiration his son had for the Jeffersons, values, and the respect they had earned. In that moment, he felt a powerful tug of remorse, knowing he had let his prejudices blind him to what was truly important. Clearing his throat, Mr. Bennett leaned forward, his voice softer than Marcus had ever heard it. "Tell me more about them, son," he said, struggling to mask the guilt beneath his curiosity. "What kind of businessman is Robert Jefferson?" Marcus, sensing a shift in his father's demeanor, continued. "He's an incredible leader, Dad. He started Prestige Motors with just a small loan and a vision, and now he employs over 100 people. But it's not just about the business. Mr. Jefferson treats his employees with respect, like family. He's a person of integrity, and he's built something meaningful." The more Marcus shared, the heavier Mr. Bennett's guilt weighed on him. He thought of the empty justification he'd used to reject the Jeffersons' application, recalling how easily he had dismissed them without understanding their character, their aspirations, or their values. Now, confronted with the truth, he couldn't ignore the possibility that he had been wrong all along. That night, Mr. Bennett sat alone in his study, weighed down by the flood of emotions Marcus's words had stirred within him. The Jefferson family's story, told through his son's admiration, exposed the harsh truth about his own actions. All his life, he had taken pride in maintaining a high standard in his properties, convinced that he was protecting his community. But now, he wondered if his rigid standards had caused him to overlook the very people who could have enriched that community. He remembered the Jeffersons' rental application and how easily he had dismissed it. The decision had felt justified at the time, a simple matter of preserving the neighborhood. Yet, listening to Marcus's praise of the Jeffersons' values, integrity, and generosity, he couldn't shake the nagging thought that he had been wrong. He had allowed his own biases to block a family that could have brought warmth and inspiration to the neighborhood he valued so highly. As he mulled over his decision, the image of the Jefferson family lingered in his mind. He pictured Robert and Clara, working hard to build their life from the ground up, guided by values that resonated deeply with his son. He thought of their children, each ambitious and kind, embodying everything he wanted for the future of his own community. With a heavy sigh, Mr. Bennett leaned back in his chair, staring at the framed photos of his properties on the wall. These were the symbols of his success, his pride, and his supposed high standards. But in that moment, they felt hollow, a shallow reflection of a man who had clung too tightly to prejudice and exclusivity. The next morning, Mr. Bennett decided he needed to see this family for himself. He didn't know what he would say or if they'd even want to speak with him, but he knew he couldn't ignore this any longer. He needed to understand them, not through paperwork or assumptions, but through genuine human connection. Over the following days, Mr. Bennett made a point of observing the Jefferson family in small, chance encounters around town. One afternoon, he noticed Robert and Clara at the local park with their children, helping clean up litter and chatting warmly with other families. The Jefferson children ran around, laughing and encouraging younger kids to join in the cleanup, turning it into a game. The sight of them brought a pang of regret to Mr. Bennett's heart. He saw how Robert and Clara led by example, fostering kindness and community-mindedness in their children. It was a simple act, but it struck him deeply. He thought of how he had dismissed this family without a second thought, unaware of the quiet strength and goodness they brought with them. A few days later, he noticed two of the Jefferson boys helping an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Langley, carry her groceries to her door. Mrs. Langley, who had once expressed her own concerns about new people moving in, seemed charmed by the boys, her usually reserved demeanor softened by their genuine smiles and willingness to help. For the first time, Mr. Bennett began to question the beliefs that had shaped his decisions. He saw how his assumptions had closed him off to people who could bring life and warmth to his carefully maintained neighborhood. He had always thought he was protecting something important, but now he realized he might have been holding back the very things that could have enriched it. One evening, as he sat on his front porch, he watched the Jefferson family walking together down the street, their laughter carrying through the evening air. He saw Robert stop to greet neighbors, exchanging friendly waves and warm smiles. It struck Mr. Bennett how easily they blended into the community, despite the barriers he had once put up. He felt a swell of shame, realizing that his own prejudices had been the only thing standing between this family and the sense of belonging they clearly cherished. The next morning, Mr. Bennett knew he couldn't carry on without addressing the mistake he'd made. He had spent years building his reputation as a successful businessman, a pillar of the community, but it was only now that he understood the true weight of that title. Being a pillar wasn't about enforcing rigid rules or exclusivity. It was about fostering growth, welcoming diversity, and creating a space where everyone had the chance to belong. Determined to make things right, Mr. Bennett made his way to Prestige Motors, hoping to speak with Robert Jefferson in person. This time, he wouldn't be hiding behind policies or rules. He would be open, vulnerable, and most importantly, honest. It was time to face the truth and to extend his hand, not in judgment, but in friendship. Mr. Bennett walked into Prestige Motors feeling a rare sense of nervousness. The polished floors and sleek display of luxury vehicles felt unfamiliar today, somehow colder than before. He was here not as a landlord or a businessman, but as a man looking to correct his mistakes. At the reception desk, a friendly assistant greeted him. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" Clearing his throat, Mr. Bennett replied, "I'm here to see Robert Jefferson if he's available." Moments later, Robert emerged from the back office, a look of pleasant surprise crossing his face. "Mr. Bennett," he greeted, extending his hand with a polite smile. "What brings you here?" They exchanged a firm handshake, and Mr. Bennett found himself momentarily at a loss for words. In front of him was the man he had turned away so easily, a man who had quietly built a successful business and a strong, compassionate family. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me, Mr. Jefferson," he said after a moment, his voice tinged with sincerity. "Of course," Robert replied, guiding him to a quieter area where they could talk. "What's on your mind?" Mr. Bennett took a deep breath, gathering the courage to speak candidly. "Mr. Jefferson, I owe you and your family an apology." He paused, glancing away briefly. "When you applied to rent one of my properties, I rejected your application, and I did it for all the wrong reasons." Robert looked at him thoughtfully, listening without interrupting. "I told myself it was to preserve the neighborhood, but the truth is I let my own prejudices get in the way," Mr. Bennett continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since then, I've seen the impact you and your family have had on the community, your kindness, your generosity, your integrity, and I realized just how wrong I was." Robert's expression softened, and after a quiet moment he spoke with a tone of understanding. "It takes courage to admit that, Mr. Bennett. I appreciate your honesty." Emboldened by Robert's compassion, Mr. Bennett continued, "Listening to my son speak so highly of you and your family, seeing the admiration he has for you, it forced me to confront my own biases, and I realized I had denied my community the presence of a family like yours." Robert nodded slowly, the sincerity of Mr. Bennett's apology resonating with him. "Mr. Bennett," he began gently, "we've all made mistakes, especially when it comes to our assumptions. What matters is how we choose to learn and grow from them." Relieved, Mr. Bennett felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, Robert," he replied, using his first name as a gesture of newfound respect. "It means a lot to me, more than I can express." After a few moments of comfortable silence, Robert extended an invitation. "Why don't you join us for dinner this weekend? Clara and the kids would be glad to meet you." The invitation took Mr. Bennett by surprise. I'd be honored," he stammered, touched by the offer. That weekend, Mr. Bennett found himself at the Jeffersons' home for dinner. Clara welcomed him warmly at the door, and their children greeted him with curious but polite smiles. The modest house was filled with laughter and lively conversation, a sharp contrast to the sterile formality he had grown accustomed to in his own home. As they sat down to eat, Mr. Bennett observed the Jefferson family's easy connection with each other. Their values, their love, and the simplicity with which they shared their lives stirred something deep within him. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt such genuine warmth in a home, a sense of belonging that didn't rely on wealth or status. During dinner, Clara asked about his family, and Mr. Bennett spoke about Marcus with a new sense of pride. The Jefferson children listened attentively, each of them displaying the values of respect and kindness their parents had clearly instilled. For the first time, Mr. Bennett allowed himself to see past the differences he had once imagined, understanding that character was never tied to appearances, but to the content of one's heart. As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Bennett thanked the Jeffersons sincerely. "Your hospitality has shown me what it means to be a part of a real community," he admitted, his voice laced with gratitude. "You've reminded me of the values I'd lost sight of." Robert placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's never too late to rediscover them," he replied with a warm smile. "We're glad to have you as part of our lives." Driving home that evening, Mr. Bennett felt lighter than he had in years. He knew his path forward wasn't yet clear, but he was ready to embrace the changes needed to become a better man, foster inclusivity, and rebuild his connection with his community. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that perhaps he could make a difference too, just as the Jeffersons had. A few weeks later, Marcus arrived home with an excited announcement. "Dad, the Jeffersons are hosting a company event next weekend," he said eagerly. "They've invited the whole team, and I'd love for you and Mom to come. It's a chance to meet the people I work with and to see what Prestige Motors is all about." Mr. Bennett, who had been reflecting deeply on his recent encounter with the Jeffersons, felt a nervous flutter at the invitation. Though he had apologized and had dinner with Robert's family, the idea of entering a social gathering hosted by them still stirred a mix of unease and anticipation. "I'm not sure, son," he replied, glancing at Mrs. Bennett. "I've never been one for big social events." Mrs. Bennett placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "I think it would be a wonderful idea, dear. Marcus wants to share his world with us, and it sounds like a lovely chance to support him." Marcus nodded, his expression hopeful. "Please, Dad, I really want you to meet them. They've had such an impact on me, and I think you'd enjoy it." Seeing the anticipation in Marcus's eyes, Mr. Bennett took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "All right," he agreed, managing a small smile. "We'll go." The day of the event arrived, and Mr. Bennett found himself pacing as they prepared to leave, adjusting his tie repeatedly. His nerves were undeniable, but Mrs. Bennett reassured him with a warm smile. "Remember, dear, this is just a gathering. Let's go in with open hearts." The drive to the event was filled with Marcus's enthusiastic chatter about his work, his colleagues, and how much he had come to admire the Jeffersons. Listening to his son's newfound passion gave Mr. Bennett a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. When they arrived at the venue, Marcus guided them inside, weaving through the crowd with familiarity and ease. His face lit up as he spotted Robert and Clara across the room, standing near a beautifully decorated table, chatting with employees who approached them with warmth and admiration. "Come on, Mom and Dad," Marcus said, leading them forward. "I'd like you to meet Mr. and Mrs. Jefferson." As they approached, Mr. Bennett felt his pulse quicken. He recognized the Jeffersons, of course, but seeing them here, surrounded by the respect and admiration of their team, was both humbling and intimidating. There was a sense of honor in the air, a feeling that this was a celebration of something much larger than just a business. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," Marcus said with pride, "I'd like you to meet Robert and Clara Jefferson, the incredible people who own Prestige Motors." Robert extended his hand with a warm smile. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you both. We've heard a lot about you from Marcus. He's a wonderful addition to our team." Mr. Bennett took Robert's hand, feeling a surge of gratitude and humility. "Likewise, Mr. Jefferson," he replied, his voice tinged with sincerity. "Thank you for the kindness you've shown my son." Clara stepped forward, her eyes sparkling with kindness. "We're thrilled to have Marcus with us. He's been doing great work, and we're proud of him." As the evening unfolded, Mr. Bennett watched with quiet awe as Robert and Clara moved among their employees, sharing personal stories, asking about families, and engaging in genuine, heartfelt conversations. The Jeffersons knew everyone's name, remembered details about their lives, and treated each person with a warmth that was rare in any corporate environment. At one point, a young intern hurried over, looking slightly flustered. "Mr. Jefferson, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have a small issue with the catering." Robert's face remained calm as he turned to the intern, his tone reassuring. "No problem, Sarah. Let's see how we can fix it together." His response was steady and composed, without a hint of frustration or impatience. Mrs. Bennett, noticing the interaction, leaned over to her husband. "Look at how everyone respects them," she whispered. "It's not forced, it's genuine. They're leading with kindness." Mr. Bennett nodded, taking it all in. Watching Robert and Clara reminded him of how differently he had once viewed leadership, as something based on authority and exclusivity. But here, in the warmth of this gathering, he saw that true leadership was about service and respect, about connecting with people rather than commanding them. As the night progressed, Mr. Bennett began to feel a quiet transformation taking place within himself. For the first time, he understood why Marcus had been so drawn to Prestige Motors, why he had spoken so highly of the Jeffersons and their values. It was more than just a job to his son. It was an opportunity to be part of something meaningful, something grounded in compassion and integrity. When it was time to leave, Mr. Bennett turned to Robert with a newfound respect. "Thank you for hosting us tonight, Mr. Jefferson. I see now what Marcus admires in you both. It's rare to find a business built on values, and you've created something truly special." Robert smiled, his handshake firm and sincere. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. We believe that success is only as meaningful as the lives it touches." As Mr. and Mrs. Bennett walked out with Marcus, a sense of peace and purpose filled Mr. Bennett. He felt as though he was finally beginning to understand the deeper values that truly mattered, values that he had long overlooked in his pursuit of exclusivity and control. After the event, Mr. Bennett couldn't shake the impact of the evening from his mind. Watching the Jeffersons' quiet, compassionate leadership had stirred something within him, making him reevaluate the life he had led and the values he had held so tightly. He began to feel a strong urge to make amends, not only for his past mistakes but for the life he wanted to build going forward. A few days later, he invited Marcus over for dinner. He felt a mixture of nerves and anticipation, knowing he had a confession to make. After dinner, as they sat in the living room, Mr. Bennett cleared his throat, signaling that he wanted to speak. "Marcus," he began slowly, "I need to tell you something I haven't been proud of." Marcus turned to his father, curiosity and a hint of concern in his eyes. "When the Jeffersons applied to rent one of my properties, I turned them down," Mr. Bennett said, his voice weighed down with regret. "And I did it because of their race. I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment, and I gave them a flimsy excuse about preserving the character of the neighborhood." He looked down, his hands clasped tightly. "It was wrong, Marcus, and I can see that now more than ever." For a moment, silence filled the room as Marcus processed his father's confession. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke, his tone calm yet firm. "Dad, I appreciate you telling me this. It means a lot that you're willing to admit it. But do you understand why it was so hurtful? The Jeffersons are exactly the kind of people who make a community better, not worse." Mr. Bennett nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I understand that now, son. Seeing the respect they've earned, the impact they've had on their employees and the community, it's made me realize how narrow-minded I was. I know I've caused pain, and I deeply regret it." Marcus reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "What matters, Dad, is that you're willing to change. That's a good start." A sense of relief washed over Mr. Bennett, but he knew there was one more step he needed to take. The next morning, he called Robert Jefferson, hoping to arrange a meeting. "Robert," he began, his tone sincere, "I'd like to speak with you if you have some time. I owe you an apology." Robert agreed to meet, and they chose a quiet coffee shop where they could talk privately. As they sat across from each other, Mr. Bennett took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Robert, I've come to apologize. When your family applied to rent from me, I turned you away for reasons I'm now ashamed of. I let my own biases affect my judgment, and I didn't consider your character or your family's values." Robert listened intently, his face open but unreadable. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Bennett," he replied gently after a moment. "It's not easy to admit when we've been wrong." Mr. Bennett felt a wave of humility as he continued. "Your family has shown me what it means to be truly successful, how it's about kindness, respect, and giving back, not just wealth or appearances. I can't undo the past, but I want you to know that I'm genuinely sorry for how I treated you and your family." Robert nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Bennett. What matters is that we learn from them. Your apology means a lot, and it shows a willingness to change. That's something we can all respect." Relief flooded Mr. Bennett, grateful beyond words for Robert's grace. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've taught me more than I can say, Robert. I've come to see how much I can learn from you and your family." As they left the cafe, Mr. Bennett felt lighter than he had in years. Robert's forgiveness had not only eased his guilt, but had given him a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, he saw a path forward that wasn't based on exclusivity or control, but on genuine community and connection. Over the next few days, Mr. Bennett began making changes in his life and in the way he approached his properties. He spoke to his tenants with a newfound respect, making an effort to understand their needs and concerns. Slowly, he let go of his rigid standards, realizing that diversity and inclusivity brought strength to his properties, creating a neighborhood that was far richer in spirit than he had ever imagined. He reached out to community leaders, offering to host events that celebrated the people who made up the heart of his neighborhood. Little by little, Mr. Bennett found himself welcomed into the community he had once tried to keep so tightly controlled, and he realized that it was through connection, not exclusion, that he could make a true difference. As the weeks passed, the transformation in Mr. Bennett was evident to those around him. Neighbors and tenants who had once seen him as distant and inflexible were surprised by the warmth and openness he now showed. Mr. Bennett became a regular at community events, speaking to residents with a genuine curiosity he hadn't shown before. His newfound approach was noticed and appreciated, especially by those who had previously felt his exclusivity was a barrier. In his properties, he began implementing changes that prioritized community engagement over strict policies. He organized monthly gatherings where tenants could get to know one another, transforming the neighborhood into a more cohesive, supportive environment. Gone were the rigid standards he had once valued so highly. In their place was a spirit of inclusivity that encouraged diversity and belonging. At one of these gatherings, Mr. Bennett found himself chatting with Mrs. Langley, an elderly neighbor who had lived in the area for decades. She had been one of the residents who had initially expressed hesitation about new people moving in. Yet, even she had softened in recent months, inspired by the goodwill spreading throughout the neighborhood. "It's nice to see everyone getting along," Mrs. Langley remarked, her voice soft with emotion. "I used to worry about the changes in our community, but now I realize it's only made us stronger. You've done well to bring everyone together, Mr. Bennett." Mr. Bennett smiled, feeling a genuine of pride, not the self-centered pride he once held in the exclusivity of his properties, but a fulfilling pride in the community's unity. "Thank you, Mrs. Langley. I used to think protecting this neighborhood meant keeping it closed off. Now I see that it's stronger when we're all included." The most heartwarming part of his journey was the friendship that grew between him and Robert Jefferson. As they spent more time together, Mr. Bennett grew to admire Robert's dedication not only to his family, but to his employees, his neighbors, and the broader community. Robert's strength and resilience had become a source of inspiration, and Mr. Bennett found himself adopting similar values, letting go of his once narrow-minded outlook. One sunny afternoon, Mr. Bennett invited Robert to his office to discuss an idea he'd been considering. He'd been brainstorming ways to make a positive impact, something that could reflect the values he now embraced. "Robert," he began, a touch of excitement in his voice, "I've been thinking about creating a fund for local families who want to buy or rent in this neighborhood but face financial barriers. Something to help with initial costs or support community projects. It's a way for me to contribute, to give back to the very community I once tried to keep so exclusive." Robert's face broke into a broad smile. "That's an incredible idea, John. Imagine the impact it could have, the families it could help. I'd be honored to support that effort in any way I can." As they discussed the details, Mr. Bennett realized that his life's purpose had shifted. He no longer cared solely about the appearance or status of his properties. Instead, he wanted to create a space where families of all backgrounds could thrive. By opening his heart and mind, he had found a new path, one that brought him more satisfaction than any business venture ever could. News of Mr. Bennett's fund spread through the community, and soon other business owners and community members began to contribute, inspired by his change of heart. The neighborhood started to come alive with new energy, a place where people could gather, support one another, and build lasting bonds. Watching the community evolve, Mr. Bennett found himself feeling fulfilled in a way he hadn't expected. The Jeffersons had opened his eyes to a life rich with purpose and connection. His days of exclusion and control felt distant, replaced by moments of laughter, shared meals, and meaningful conversations with people he had once disregarded. One evening, Mr. Bennett received a letter from a family who had benefited from the community fund. They thanked him for giving them the chance to live in a neighborhood that felt like home, a place where they could raise their children without fear of being excluded. Tears welled up in Mr. Bennett's eyes as he read the letter, realizing that his journey had come full circle. He had once been a man defined by his boundaries, but now he was a man who valued inclusion and generosity above all else. The Jeffersons had shown him the way, and in turn, he had become a part of a community he was proud to call his own. Mr. Bennett's life had taken on a rhythm he'd never anticipated. Where he once measures worth by property values and exclusivity, He now found satisfaction in meaningful contributions to the community. Each day brought new ways to connect with people he'd previously kept at a distance, and the community center had become one of his favorite places to volunteer. There, he could see firsthand how small acts of kindness could make a profound difference. One particular morning, Mr. Bennett received a call from the community center director. "John, we're organizing a workshop to help local families with financial literacy, basic budgeting, saving, and even homeownership planning. Would you be interested in leading it? I know you have a wealth of experience in property management." The idea thrilled Mr. Bennett. He had spent his career in real estate, but now he saw an opportunity to use his skills in a new way, one that could empower families who, like the Jeffersons, had once faced unnecessary barriers. He agreed enthusiastically, and within days, he prepared materials, researched community resources, and organized sessions to help participants learn the basics of saving and managing finances. When the workshop day arrived, Mr. Bennett was greeted by a group of eager attendees, each with their own goals and dreams. Some wanted to rent, others to buy, but all shared a common hope of creating a stable home for their families. He was struck by how openly they shared their struggles, their determination palpable. Gone was his previous outlook of screening out those who didn't meet a certain standard. Instead, he felt honored to help them take their next steps. He introduced himself and explained his history, being transparent about his own growth. "I used to think wealth was just about accumulating things," he admitted. "But now I know it's about building something meaningful together. We're here to help each other, to make our community a place where everyone can feel secure." The sessions were a success. People left with the knowledge they could use, and Mr. Bennett left with a heart full of purpose. Over the following weeks, he expanded his workshops to cover various topics, from home improvement and maintenance to financial planning for families. Each workshop brought more community members, and each day he felt more at home than he ever had in his own properties. While the Jefferson family had continued to be a positive influence on Mr. Bennett's life, their friendship grew as they shared meals, laughed, and discussed community projects. Robert had even joined Mr. Bennett's initiative to create a neighborhood mentorship program, aimed at pairing experienced professionals with young adults seeking guidance in their careers. One weekend, Mr. Bennett sat with Robert and Clara over coffee, discussing the impact of their recent initiatives. Mr. Bennett leaned back, a smile of contentment on his face. "I never would have imagined my life turning out like this. I spent so many years trying to keep things separate, my properties, my tenants, and even my neighbors. But I see now how much better it feels to open the doors and let people in." Clara nodded, her smile warm. "We're glad you feel that way, John. When we build walls, we keep out so much potential for connection and growth. I think you've shown us all the power of change." Robert placed a hand on Mr. Bennett's shoulder. "The community center is better with you there. You've brought so much energy and heart to it. People look up to you, John, not because of what you have, but because of what you're giving back." The words touched Mr. Bennett deeply. It had taken him so long to understand the difference between prestige and purpose, and to realize that his real legacy would be the impact he made on others' lives, not the properties he'd acquired. As the weeks turned into months, Mr. Bennett continued to invest himself fully in community efforts. He spearheaded new programs, reached out to local businesses for support, and even encouraged other landlords to adopt more inclusive practices. His days were no longer filled with concerns about property values or tenant screenings, but with the genuine joy of knowing he was part of something larger than himself. One afternoon, as he walked through the community garden he had helped establish, he overheard a conversation between two teenagers. "Mr. Bennett's so different now," one of them said. "He used to be kind of scary, but now he's like a mentor to everyone." The words made Mr. Bennett pause, a surge of gratitude filling his chest. He realized that he had not only transformed his own life, but had also helped change the lives of others, inspiring people to rethink their own values and the importance of community. Standing in that garden, surrounded by neighbors who now saw him as a friend and ally, Mr. Bennett felt at peace. The Jeffersons had shown him the way, but he had chosen to walk it. In doing so, he had found a purpose beyond wealth, a purpose rooted in giving, in growth, and in a community that now felt like home. As time passed, the neighborhood continued to blossom into a vibrant, inclusive community, and Mr. Bennett found himself at the heart of it all. The community center had become a second home for him, a place where he could both teach and learn. With each passing day, he became more deeply connected to the people he once distanced himself from, seeing them as individuals with hopes, dreams, and stories as meaningful as his own. One evening, the community center held a special event to celebrate the year's achievements, a multicultural festival highlighting the diverse cultures that now make up the neighborhood. The hall was filled with tables laden with dishes from around the world, music and laughter echoing from every corner. Banners of celebrating our community hung from the walls, a fitting tribute to the journey they had all taken together. Robert Jefferson took the stage to give a short speech. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on Mr. Bennett with a smile that conveyed deep respect and gratitude. "Tonight, we're not just celebrating our neighborhood," Robert began. "We're celebrating the power of change, the strength of forgiveness, and the value of inclusion. And we owe much of this progress to someone who's shown us all what it means to grow and give back." The crowd turned to Mr. Bennett, applauding warmly, and he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He rose to join Robert on stage, taking a moment to gather his thoughts before he spoke. "When I first came to this community, I thought my role was to build it my way, keeping to certain standards and maintaining exclusivity," Mr. Bennett admitted, his voice carrying a hint of the vulnerability he had learned to embrace. "But what I've learned is that community isn't about keeping people out. It's about welcoming people in, embracing differences, and supporting each other. And for that, I have all of you, and especially the Jefferson family, to thank." A round of applause filled the room, and Mr. Bennett looked out over the crowd, feeling a warmth he had never known. He had once believed that success meant wealth, status, and control. But now he understood that true success was found in the connections he had made, the lives he had touched, and the friendships he had built. As he stepped down from the stage, a group of neighborhood children, including the Jefferson kids, approached him, their faces bright with admiration. Ethan, the oldest of Robert and Clara's sons, shook Mr. Bennett's hand firmly. "Mr. Bennett, thank you for all you've done for our community," he said earnestly. "You've taught us what it means to care for one another." Overwhelmed, Mr. Bennett nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Ethan. But I think you and your family taught me far more than I could ever teach anyone." Later that evening, he found himself standing in a quiet corner of the community garden he had helped create. Surrounded by vibrant plants and the faint glow of string lights, he reflected on the journey he had taken, from a man who guarded his exclusivity to someone who valued inclusion and compassion. He marveled at the peace he now felt, a sense of belonging that filled his heart in a way that wealth or power never could. Mrs. Bennett joined him, slipping her arm through his as they looked out over the festivities. "You've come a long way, John," she murmured, pride shining in her eyes. He smiled softly, nodding. "We both have. I can't imagine going back to who I was before. This community has changed me. It's given me a new purpose, one that I never thought I'd find." They watched as neighbors laughed, children played, and friends gathered, each person a reminder of the beauty and strength that came from unity. Mr. Bennett knew that his transformation was only the beginning, and that he had many more years of growth, learning, and giving back to look forward to. The Jeffersons had opened his eyes, but it was his choice to walk the path they had shown him. As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Bennett was filled with a sense of gratitude. His wealth and status had once defined him, but now he was defined by the relationships he had built, the lives he had touched, and the legacy of kindness and community he was creating. The laughter and joy of the festival lingered in his heart as he walked home that night. He knew he had finally found true success, not in his properties or status, but in the simple yet profound connections he had made. For the first time in his life, Mr. Bennett was at peace, surrounded by a community that he was proud to call his own. Mr. Bennett's journey is a touching reminder of the power of personal transformation. Once a man focused on status and exclusivity, he learned to find true purpose in connecting with and supporting the people around him. Through his friendship with the Jefferson family, Mr. Bennett realized that real success isn't measured by wealth or property. It's found in the compassion we show and the bonds we build. This story teaches us that a community's strength doesn't come from barriers that keep people out, but from open arms that welcome everyone in. When we choose to open our hearts, we not only create a richer life for ourselves, but help build a kinder, more inclusive world for everyone. If you found this story meaningful, comment 1 below. If you found it truly inspiring, comment 2. And don't hesitate to share your own stories with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories coming soon. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below.